I never imagined that my life would take this turn, standing here outside Mr. Cole's office with my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was dim, quiet except for the occasional creak of the building settling in the night. Everyone else had left hours ago, but here I was, nervously smoothing my skirt, trying to calm my erratic heartbeat. This wasn't the first time I'd worked late with Mr. Cole. Our job demanded long hours, late nights, and last-minute deadlines. But lately there was something different in the air, something unspoken that neither of us dared acknowledge. It started innocently enough, as these things often do. Mr. Cole was always professional, his demeanor calm and collected. He wasn't the type to get flustered, and even when work piled up, he handled it with ease. I admired him for that. His authority was comforting, and his leadership had taught me a lot since I joined the team. But something shifted between us in the past few months. There were glances that lasted too long, words that carried more weight than they should, conversations stretched out beyond work, dipping into personal territory. It had all been subtle at first. A smile here, a touch of the hand as he handed me a report, moments that were perfectly appropriate yet seemed to mean more. But it wasn't just me. I could tell that he felt it too. There were times during meetings when his gaze would linger on me just a second too long, or his voice would drop into a tone that made my heart flutter unexpectedly. And then came the evening that would change everything. It was late again, well past the time most people had gone home. We were the only two left in the office, as we often were, both of us working quietly on a last-minute proposal. The low hum of the computer was the only sound in the room, broken occasionally by the soft shuffle of papers. I was sitting across from him at the long conference table, my eyes glued to the screen, trying to focus on the endless stream of numbers. But I couldn't help but feel his presence. He was sitting closer than usual, and the air between us felt charged with something I couldn't quite name. I glanced up at him, expecting him to be engrossed in his work, but his eyes were already on me. The way he looked at me made my pulse quicken. It wasn't just a casual glance, there was an intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to brush it off, but the warmth of his eyes lingered on my skin, and I felt a strange pull toward him. "How's it coming along?" His voice broke the silence, but it was lower than usual, softer. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the effect he was having on me. "Almost done. Just checking these final numbers." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something unspoken in the air, something that had been building for weeks. I felt the tension in my body, the way my heart raced in response to his closeness. We had never crossed any lines, but suddenly it felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't ignore. "You've been doing great work lately," he said, leaning back in his chair, but his gaze stayed locked on me. "I don't think I tell you that enough." I smiled, trying to remain composed, but my hands felt shaky under the table. "Thank you. That means a lot." He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table, his face just inches away from mine now. The soft light of the desk lamp cast shadows on his sharp features, making his expression harder to read. You know, it's rare to find someone who's so dedicated. The compliment hung in the air, and I could feel the distance between us shrinking. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I couldn't look away. His words, though simple, carried an intimacy that made my breath catch in my throat. I started to respond, but my voice faltered. The air was thick, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on me like a physical touch. My heart pounded harder, and I knew that something had changed between us. He reached across the table, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was brief, almost casual, but it set off a wave of heat through me. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the feelings coursing through me. He shouldn't be touching me like that. This was my boss, the man I looked up to, the man who held so much authority over my career. But I didn't pull away. Instead, I felt a magnetic pull, a desire that I couldn't push down any longer. The lingering glances, the moments we'd shared, all of it came rushing back, and suddenly it made sense. I wasn't imagining it. He felt it too. "We should probably finish this up," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice shook. I couldn't focus on the numbers anymore. The computer screen was just a blur. All I could think about was how close he was, how his hand had felt against mine. "Yeah, we should," he agreed, but he didn't move. His eyes were darker now, filled with something I couldn't quite name. He was hesitating, fighting the same internal battle that I was. Silence stretched between us, thick with tension. I could feel the room closing in, the boundaries we had always maintained slipping away. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible. My body was aware of him in a way I couldn't ignore. The steady rise and fall of his breath, the warmth radiating from him, the way his hand had felt against mine, all of it was driving me to the brink of something I had never anticipated. He started, but his voice trailed off. He looked down at the papers scattered on the table, then back at me, his expression conflicted. And then, as if some invisible line had snapped, he stood up and walked toward me. My heart leapt into my throat as he came closer, the space between us shrinking with every step. He stopped right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "About what?" He smiled, but it was a sad, hesitant smile. "You know what?" The truth hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. We had been dancing around it for weeks, pretending that nothing had changed, but it was too late to go back now. His hand reached out again, this time cupping my face gently, his thumb brushing along my cheek. The touch was tender, careful, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. "I don't want to cross any lines," he said softly, his breath warm against my skin. "But I can't stop thinking about you." My heart raced at his words. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, and I knew I should stop this, should say something to break the moment. But I didn't want to. Every part of me wanted him closer. "I've been thinking about you too," I admitted, my voice barely audible. It was the truth, the confession that had been building inside me for weeks. His gaze darkened, and I could feel the tension between us shift into something more urgent. He leaned in slowly, his face just inches from mine, and I could feel his breath on my lips. My entire body tingled with anticipation, my hands trembling in my lap as I waited for him to make the next move. "I shouldn't do this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't think I can stop." And then, before I could respond, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was still unsure whether we should be doing this. But as soon as I responded, everything changed. The floodgates opened, and the tension that had been simmering between us for so long finally erupted. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, more intense now. I melted into him, my arms wrapping around his neck as I gave into the moment. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before, the way his touch made my skin come alive, the way his lips moved against mine with a mix of hunger and restraint. We broke apart for a breath, and I could feel the weight of what we had just done hanging in the air between us. His forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his rapid breath mingling with mine. He didn't speak, and neither did I. We both knew what had just happened, and we both knew that everything had changed. "We've crossed a line," he finally said, his voice low and rough. I nodded, my hands still resting on his chest. "I know." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. There was a vulnerability there that I hadn't expected. "I don't know where we go from here." I didn't have an answer. I had no idea what came next, no idea how we could possibly go back to the way things had been. But I knew one thing for certain: I didn't regret it. "We'll figure it out," I said softly, hoping to reassure both of us. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, we will." He stood there for a moment longer, as if torn between staying and leaving. Finally, he took a step back, his hand slipping from my waist. "I should go," he said quietly. "We shouldn't." He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. We couldn't stay here, not like this. The walls of the office felt too close, too intimate now. "I'll see you tomorrow," I asked, my voice hesitant. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned and walked out of the room. I stood there, alone in the dim light, my heart still racing. Everything had changed in that one moment, and there was no going back. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a pit in my stomach. The events of the previous night replayed over and over in my mind, leaving me restless and unsure of what to expect. Would he act like nothing happened? Would things between us be awkward, tense? Or worse, would we pretend that the kiss never occurred and push everything aside, burying the undeniable attraction that had now fully surfaced? The usual hum of the office greeted me, but today it felt different. Each step I took toward my desk felt heavier, like I was carrying the weight of a secret that no one else knew but me and Mr. Cole. I placed my bag down, mechanically going through the motions of starting my day, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in the loop of his words, his touch, and the unspoken promises that lingered between us. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from him. "Can you come to my office when you have a moment?" My heart leapt into my throat. There was no context, no explanation. Was this about last night? Was he regretting everything? I had no idea how I would handle it if he wanted to act like it hadn't happened. But at the same time, I wasn't ready to confront the reality of what we'd done. I took a deep breath and made my way to his office. The door was slightly ajar, and I paused for a moment before knocking softly. His voice came from within, calm and measured as usual. "Come in." I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. He was seated behind his desk, looking down at some papers, his face unreadable. The room felt smaller, more intimate, as if it still held the remnants of the tension from the night before. "Close the door," he said, glancing up at me briefly before returning to his work. I did as he asked, the soft click of the door sounding louder than it should have. I walked over to the chair in front of his desk, unsure if I should sit or stand. My palms were sweaty, and I tried to calm the nervous energy surging through me. "Have a seat," he said, his voice neutral, giving nothing away. I sat down, my heart racing. He didn't look at me right away, continuing to shuffle through the papers in front of him. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything we weren't saying. Finally, he set the papers aside and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. His eyes met mine, and I could see the same conflict in his gaze that I felt deep in my gut. "About last night," he started, his tone even, though I could hear the slight tremor beneath the calm. "I've been thinking about it." My stomach twisted, and I felt a rush of anxiety. Was this it? Was he going to tell me that we had made a mistake, that we had to forget everything? "I want to be honest with you," he continued, his eyes locked on mine. "What happened between us? It wasn't something I planned. It wasn't something I thought would ever happen." He paused, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with the weight of his words. "But I can't deny how I feel." His confession hit me like a wave, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. He wasn't brushing it off, wasn't pretending it didn't mean anything. The tension in my body eased slightly, but only for a moment. But he continued, his tone more serious now. "We need to be careful. This changes everything." I nodded, unable to find the right words. He was right, everything had changed. The professional boundary between us had been shattered, and there was no going back. But part of me didn't want to go back. I wanted to see where this could go, even though I knew the risks. "I don't regret what happened," he said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "But I don't want to make things harder for you here or anywhere else." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I felt the weight of all my emotions crashing down on me. The attraction between us was undeniable, but the reality of our situation was equally unavoidable. "We need to be smart about this," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "If we decide to pursue this, we need to be sure that it's what we both want." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing with 100 different thoughts, but at the core of it all, I knew what I wanted. "I don't regret it either," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper, "but I don't know what this means for us." He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither do I. But I think it's worth figuring out." For the first time since I had walked into the room, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this didn't have to be the end. Maybe we could find a way to navigate this new dynamic without losing everything we had built. But he added, his tone firm now, "We have to be careful. We can't let this interfere with work." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I agree." There was a long pause as we both sat there, the tension between us still present but no longer unbearable. I could feel the unspoken connection between us, the same pull that had brought us together the night before. "So where does that leave us?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, his gaze steady. "I think we take it one step at a time. No rushing, no pressure. We see where this goes, but we don't let it affect what we do here." His words made sense, and I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't the resolution I had expected, but it was something. It was a way forward, even if it was uncertain. "We'll figure it out," I said softly, echoing the words he had said the night before. He smiled, a real smile this time, and for a moment, the tension between us lifted. There was still so much unsaid, so much that we hadn't figured out, but I knew that we were on the same page. "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Now, let's get back to work." I smiled, feeling the weight of the moment begin to ease. We weren't done yet, but we were on the same path, and that was enough for now. As I stood to leave, his hand brushed mine for just a second, a small, subtle gesture that sent a shiver through me. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder of the connection we shared, the pull that neither of us could ignore. I walked out of his office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least now we had a direction, a way forward. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails, but my mind kept drifting back to him, to the conversation we had shared, to the possibilities that now stretched out before us. What would this look like in the weeks to come? Could we really balance this new dynamic with our professional lives? And more importantly, could we trust ourselves not to let it spiral out of control? The days following our conversation passed in a strange haze, a mix of routine and anticipation that kept me on edge. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Mr. Cole was professional, calm, and composed as always. But beneath the thin veneer of work and meetings, there was an undeniable tension, a pull that neither of us could ignore. Every glance across the conference table, every brush of his hand against mine when we exchanged papers, was charged with meaning. I found myself thinking about him constantly. His voice, his touch, the way his eyes would linger on mine just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was intoxicating and confusing all at once. I had never been in this position before, and it felt like I was walking a tightrope between desire and danger. Part of me wanted to see him outside of the office, to explore what had started that night in the conference room. But the other part of me, the rational part, knew that we had to be careful, that this was a situation that could easily spiral out of control if we weren't cautious. Still, I couldn't stop myself from wondering about him. Did he think about me as much as I thought about him? Did he lie awake at night, replaying our moments together in his mind, just as I did? It wasn't long before we found ourselves alone again. It was another late evening at the office, and everyone else had gone home. I had stayed behind to finish up a project, hoping to avoid the growing pile of work waiting for me the next day. The office was quiet, the only sound the soft tapping of my fingers on the keyboard. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't hear him approach. Late again. His voice startled me, and I looked up to find him standing in the doorway of my office, leaning casually against the frame. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and he looked more relaxed than I had ever seen him. My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, just trying to get this finished before tomorrow," I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden rush of nerves. He walked into the room, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silence, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had been simmering between us for days was back, more intense than ever. He moved closer to my desk, his eyes never leaving mine. "You work too hard," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You need to take a break." I smiled, trying to keep things light. Says the man who's still here at 9 o'clock. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and intimate in the quiet room. "Touche." There was a pause, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, thick with unspoken words. He stepped closer, rounding the desk until he was standing just inches away from me. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. "I've been thinking about you," he said quietly, his voice dropping to that familiar, almost dangerous tone, "a lot." My breath hitched, and I felt my heart slam against my ribs. His admission sent a jolt through me, confirming what I had suspected, but hearing it aloud made it real, tangible. My mind raced as I tried to find the right words, something that would keep the situation from spiraling, but I was powerless under the weight of his gaze. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darkened, and in that moment, the carefully constructed walls we had built between us crumbled. He reached out, his hand brushing the back of my neck as he leaned down, his breath warm against my skin. The room seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us, suspended in the thick silence of what we both knew was about to happen. I could have stopped it. I could have said no, stepped away, maintained the distance we had both agreed was necessary, but I didn't want to. I couldn't. The pull between us was too strong, and before I knew it, I was standing, my hands gripping his shirt as I pressed my body against his. His lips met mine with a fierce urgency, a hunger that had been building for weeks. The kiss was deep, consuming, and I lost myself in it, in him. His hands slid down my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. I could feel his heart pounding in time with mine, and the heat between us was overwhelming, electric. We broke apart for a moment, both of us breathless, our foreheads resting together as we tried to catch our breath. His hands cupped my face, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. I wanted him more than I had ever admitted to myself. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice rough, filled with need and concern. I nodded, my fingers tightening in his shirt. Yes. That was all he needed. He kissed me again, slower this time, but just as intense. Every touch, every movement was deliberate, as if we were both trying to memorize the feel of each other. His hands roamed my body, and I could feel the heat pooling in my stomach, the desire that had been building for so long now fully ignited. We moved together, our bodies in sync, the tension between us finally giving way to something deeper, something that had been waiting to be unleashed. It was passionate, raw, and overwhelming, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the office, not the consequences, just him and me, and the connection that we could no longer ignore. After what felt like an eternity, we finally pulled apart, our bodies still pressed close, our breathing ragged. He rested his forehead against mine, his fingers brushing gently through my hair. "I didn't expect this," he whispered, his voice filled with both wonder and regret. "But I don't want to stop." I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. I didn't want to stop either, but I knew that this was only the beginning of something much more complicated. We were standing on the edge of something we couldn't take back, something that could change everything. And yet, in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. The days that followed felt like living in two parallel worlds, one where we were colleagues, polite and professional, exchanging pleasantries in meetings, discussing quarterly reports, and interacting as if nothing had ever happened between us. And then there was the other world, the secret one we inhabited when no one else was watching. In that world, every glance carried a hidden meaning, every accidental touch was a reminder of the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. We still kept our distance at work, but it was undeniable. The brief moments when we found ourselves alone in the hallway, or the elevator felt electric, filled with an unspoken promise of what had passed between us and what might still come. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Even when I tried to focus on my work, my thoughts would drift back to those stolen moments, his touch, the way his lips had felt against mine, the way his voice had softened when he asked if I was sure. It was all consuming, and the more I tried to push it aside, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't long before the distance between us crumbled again. It was another late night, much like the first time. The office was nearly empty, and I was finishing up some last-minute revisions on a project. The soft glow of my computer screen was the only light in the room, casting long shadows on the walls. I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching, but I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Still hear his voice, deep and calm, filled the quiet space. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his tie already loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He looked tired, but there was something else in his expression, something that made my heart race all over again. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "just finishing up some work." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The soft click of the latch sent a jolt through me, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. "You always work too hard," he said, walking over to stand beside my desk. His tone was casual, but I could feel the tension in the air between us, the same tension that had been building since that night. I smiled weakly, glancing down at my keyboard to avoid meeting his gaze. "Says the man who never leaves before me." He chuckled softly, and the sound made my stomach flip. He moved closer, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. I knew what was happening, what was about to happen, but I was powerless to stop it. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice dropping to that same low, intimate tone he had used before. A lot. I looked up then, meeting his eyes. There was no hiding from it now. His confession hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken in response. The office suddenly felt too warm, too close. "I've been thinking about you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darkened, and before I could say anything else, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a wave of heat through me, a reminder of everything we had shared. I leaned into his touch, unable to stop myself. "We shouldn't do this," he whispered, though his hand remained on my cheek, his thumb brushing gently across my skin. "But I can't stop thinking about you." His words echoed my own thoughts, and for a moment, all the reasons why this was wrong faded into the background. All I could think about was him, his touch, his scent, the way his presence made my heart race. "Neither can I whispered, and with that, the last of our restraint crumbled. He pulled me to my feet, his hands sliding down to my waist as his lips found mine in a kiss that was both urgent and tender. It felt different this time, not just the fire of desire, but something deeper, something that had been building between us for months. His hands roamed my body, and I could feel the tension unraveling between us, replaced by a heat that made my skin tingle. We moved together, stumbling toward the small couch in the corner of the room. The intensity of the kiss deepened, and soon we were lost in each other, our movements growing more frantic, more desperate. His hands were everywhere on my back, my waist, my thighs, and I couldn't get enough of him. The world outside that room ceased to exist, and all that mattered was him, the way he made me feel. It was passionate and consuming, but there was something else beneath it all, an intimacy that neither of us had acknowledged before. It wasn't just physical. There was an emotional connection here, one that had been quietly growing for months, hidden beneath the layers of professionalism and propriety. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and tangled in each other, I could see the same conflict in his eyes that I felt in my heart. We had crossed a line that we couldn't uncross, and while part of me was thrilled by the closeness we shared, another part of me was terrified of what came next. "We're going to get caught," I said softly, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. He shook his head, his thumb brushing lightly over my bottom lip. "No one's here, it's just us." The words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. I knew we couldn't keep this a secret forever. Eventually, someone would notice the way we looked at each other, the way we seemed to gravitate toward each other. And then what? What would happen to us, to our careers, to everything we had worked so hard to build? But in that moment, none of it mattered. All I could think about was how much I wanted him, how much I needed him, and from the way he held me, I knew he felt the same. "Let's not worry about that right now," he said, his voice soft and full of longing. "Let's just be here, in this moment." I nodded, leaning into him as his lips brushed against mine once more. The future could wait. For now, all that mattered was him and the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. We spent the rest of the night together, locked in each other's arms, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. But as the night wore on and the reality of our situation crept back in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something we couldn't control. The passion between us was undeniable, but the consequences loomed large on the horizon. As I lay in his arms, my head resting on his chest, I wondered if we were making a mistake. If the connection we shared, as powerful as it was enough to outweigh everything we were risking. The following days were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken words. We became masters of navigating the thin line between our public selves and the private world we'd created. At work, we were the picture of professionalism, our exchanges crisp, polite, and devoid of anything that could raise suspicion. But outside of the office, when we were alone, it was a different story. The chemistry between us was palpable, impossible to ignore, and it grew stronger with every secret touch, every lingering look, every time we found ourselves in each other's arms. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of what we were doing began to press down on me. Every stolen kiss, every late-night meeting filled me with both exhilaration and dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the potential consequences, how one misstep could unravel everything. And yet, I found myself incapable of walking away. The pull between us was too strong, too deep, and I had never felt so alive, so seen. One evening, after another long day, I found myself sitting in his office. The door was locked, the blinds drawn, and the world outside felt miles away. He sat beside me on the small couch, his hand resting on mine, the warmth of his touch grounding me in the moment. But tonight, something felt different. The tension that had always been between us wasn't there. Instead, there was a heaviness in the air, a quiet contemplation that hung over us like a cloud. He hadn't spoken much since I'd arrived, and I could feel the distance growing between us, though neither of us had moved. Finally, after what felt like hours of silence, he spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and measured, "about us." I turned to look at him, my heart sinking at the seriousness in his tone. "What about us?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time, I saw the weight of everything we'd been carrying reflected in his eyes. "I care about you," he said softly, "more than I ever expected to. But this, what we're doing, it's dangerous." The words hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. I had known this conversation was coming, had felt it building in the space between us for days, but hearing him say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "I know," I whispered, my throat tight, "but I don't want to stop." His hand tightened around mine, and for a moment, he just looked at me, his gaze full of emotion. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But we can't keep going like this. It's only a matter of time before someone finds out, and I don't want that for you. I don't want you to lose everything because of me." The truth of his words hit me hard. We were playing with fire, and deep down, I had always known that. Our relationship, as thrilling and consuming as it was, couldn't exist in the shadows forever. But the thought of losing him, of giving up what we had, felt unbearable. "I don't care about that," I said, my voice breaking. "I care about you." He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "I care about you too, more than you know. But we have to be smart. If we keep going like this, it's going to end badly for both of us." Tears welled in my eyes, and I blinked them back, not wanting to cry. "So, what are you saying? Are you ending this?" His expression softened, and he leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine. "I'm not saying that. But we need to take a step back, to figure out what we're doing before we destroy everything we've built." His words, though logical, felt like a dagger to my heart. The intensity between us had become such a huge part of my life, of my identity, and the thought of stepping away from it felt impossible. "But I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice trembling. "You won't," he whispered, his lips brushing lightly against my forehead. "But we can't keep pretending like this won't catch up with us." We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us moving, neither of us ready to say goodbye to what we had. His arms wrapped around me, holding me close as if he, too, was struggling with the decision we both knew had to be made. And yet, despite the heaviness of the moment, there was still a part of me that hoped, that believed we could find a way to make this work. Maybe we could keep things as they were, keep our secret hidden, and continue living in both worlds. But deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep living like this, caught between desire and responsibility, between what we wanted and what we knew was right. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled back slightly, looking down at me with a sad, tender smile. "Let's take some time," he said softly. "Let's figure out what we really want, without the pressure of the office hanging over us." I nodded, though the thought of stepping back filled me with dread. "Okay," I whispered. He kissed me gently, one last time, and I clung to the moment, not wanting it to end. But eventually, we pulled apart, and the reality of what we had agreed to began to sink in. As I left his office that night, I felt the weight of our decision settling over me. The excitement, the thrill of our secret affair, had given way to something much more complicated, something that neither of us could control. In the weeks that followed, we kept our distance. The stolen moments, the lingering touches, all of it faded into the background as we both tried to navigate the fragile balance we had created. Our connection was still there, undeniable and powerful, but we were both too afraid to cross the line again, too aware of the consequences waiting on the other side. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't help but wonder if this was really the end. Could we truly step away from each other, from the feelings that had brought us together in the first place? Or was this just a pause, a moment of hesitation before we gave in to the inevitable pull between us once more? Only time would tell.